Good afternoon, and welcome to our Pastoring in Partisan Times webinar series. I'm Kim Jinney, the Director of Connectional Ministries for the Missouri Annual Conference. Over the course of 4 weeks, we are hearing from 4 different leaders on the challenge of pastoring in what seems to be increasingly partisan times. And through their different perspectives and outlooks, our hope is that we provide some insight and guidance for clergy who are navigating these waters, and to especially remind ourselves that the church is uniquely positioned to offer hope to a divisive and tense world. So as we begin today's conversation, I invite you to join me in a word of prayer. Let us pray. Pour out your Holy Spirit on today's conversation, O God, and on our presenter, Adam. Help us to be the leaders that you have called into this holy work. Grant us insight and wisdom and enlightenment into our ministries and into the people of God that we have been called to serve. Through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Adam Hamilton is the founding pastor of the United Methodist Church of the Resurrection in Leawood, Kansas. He launched the Church of the Resurrection with his wife and 2 children in 1990. And since then, it has grown to over 20,000 adults and children under his leadership. Today, the church is the largest United Methodist Church in the United States with an average weekend attendance of over 12,000. The congregation has a threefold focus: connecting with thinking people and inviting them to become followers of Jesus Christ, engaging in acts of justice and mercy in the community, and working to renew the United Methodist Church. Named as one of the 10 people to watch in America's spiritual landscape by Religion and Ethics Newsweekly and United Methodist Person of the Year in 2012 by the United Methodist Reporter. For his leadership in the United Methodist Church, he's received numerous awards for community service and racial reconciliation. A writer of over 21 books, Adam and LaVon have been married for 35 years and have 2 adult daughters and 1, I know, beloved granddaughter.
Yes,
Welcome,
that's right.
Reverend Hamilton, to the conversation. We're glad to have you
so
with
much.
us.
Kim, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be with you.
Absolutely. And I also want to just thank you for coming on the heels of what looks to be a wonderful European visit. I've been enjoying your videos from abroad as we celebrate 500 years of the Reformation. So thank you for that work for the church.
Absolutely.
So we're going to just dive right in because I know there are a lot of people on the line that have lots of questions and know that you have a lot of lived experience dealing with the very issues that this webinar series hopes to address. But I want to start us off with a question about kind of the nature of the United Methodist Church in the United States. And that's based on a recent study from Hirsch and Molina that found that Methodism is one of America's most politically divided denominations, with both our congregations and our pastors roughly split right down the middle, it seems, between the Democratic and Republican parties. And so I'm wondering, when you hear that information, what do you think that means for us? What does that mean for you as a pastor? What does it mean for the pastors on the line?
Right. Well, at Resurrection, we have often the candidates running for office. We might have both Republican and Democratic candidates running for the same office. In fact, I have that in a couple of elections coming up. And so, you recognize in our congregation, I'd say it's probably 60-40. We're in a very red state, and we're in a very red county in a red state. So we're probably 60% Republican, 40% Democrat. And then even there's a wide range of, very progressive or moderate, and very conservative and moderate. And so for us, that looks like I have to think about what I'm preaching through that lens. I have to understand these are the people who are sitting in the congregation. And whatever I'm going to be talking about, I can't just get up and, spout whatever comes to my mind or whatever my personal convictions are without first trying to understand where are my hearers coming from.
And in a recent article in the Atlantic that featured yours truly, the interpretation of your approach was considered nonpartisan by the writer. And how do you think you're doing in that regard? Like, do you feel, when you look back over the past 6 months, do you feel like, yeah, I'm nonpartisan. That's an accurate description.
Yeah, I first of all, one of the things I'd say regularly is, and when people join the church, I even say, people say to me, I don't get you. Are you liberal or conservative? Which are you? And I say, yes, of course. And they say, well, no, which are you? And I'm like, no, those are both really good words. The liberal means to be generous. It means to be open in spirit and heart, ready to reform. And we just celebrated the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. Luther was a liberal in his day. But today, we would consider him a conservative probably. And so I say there are things we need to conserve and hold on to, and there are things we need to be, really challenging the norms on. And so I would say when I'm preaching, there are some folks who have me pegged, as more progressive. There are other folks who say, I'm not really sure where you exactly stand, but you challenge me, and I really appreciate that. But when I talk about nonpartisan, it means I'm not going to be identifying or supporting a particular candidate or a particular party. I talk about there are things about the Republican Party that I value and that I think are right, and there are things about the Democratic Party that I value and I think are right. And so I'm not going to be pegged in one of those. I will try to be independent as much as possible, even though I do, I am registered in one party. I've even switched my registration. In Kansas, it's no fun if you don't get to vote in the primaries, and so sometimes the funds in the primaries, you got to, sign up that way. But what I try to do is I try to help people understand. So here's my basic approach on issues. So we're going to talk about controversial issues. When we do, I'm going to try to help people understand. If it's controversial, that means there's a large number of people who might be on either side of the issue, right? Things aren't controversial if only 5% of the population believes this and 95% believes something else. So the hard issues are the ones at which there's lots of disagreement. So part of what I try to do is to lay out, so in a 30-minute sermon, I might spend 12 minutes, 10 minutes laying out one side of the issue as a thoughtful Christian might see it. So if it's guns, let's say it's guns. I might lay out, here's where somebody who's a thoughtful Christian might come out when it comes to guns. And these sermons come up, of course, after acts of violence that happen, anyway. So after spending 10 minutes with that, the people who are, let's say, the pro, I'm for, the right to have guns and limited legislation or restrictions on it, those folks say, hey, he understands me. He gets where I'm coming from. And then on the opposite side, I'm going to come in and say, now here's where other Christians who really wrestle with this and have questions, here are the questions they're asking. By the time I'm done with that, the folks on the other side they're like, well, wow, he understands where I'm coming from. He has articulated what I'm feeling. And then I'm going to spend the last 10 minutes saying, here's where I'm at right now. I could be wrong about this. I may not have understood this properly, but as I try to think about how the scriptures relate to the underlying issues here, this is what I'm thinking. I'm giving you permission to disagree with me. I could be wrong, but I want you to at least think about these things. And so I find if you're able to articulate, where people get upset largely is when you've created a straw man and then you tear it apart from the pulpit. And they go, wait, that's not what I believe about that. You've just made my position look really bad, and it doesn't reflect what I believe. And you've done that in the name of God from the pulpit. And that makes people really upset. When you've articulated as well as they could have their view, and then you come in and articulate another side, and you remain neutral up to that point. In the last 10 minutes, you can come in with humility and say, either I try to do this, here's some common ground, here's some places where we can agree. We're divided in our congregation. Here's some places where we can find common ground, or here's how I see it right now. And I may be wrong, but I want to lay this out for you. And what I found is when I do that, you open the door for people to have an aha moment. You open the door for people to go, okay, he's not poking his finger in my eye. He's not made a straw man out of my argument. Instead, he's thoughtfully understood where I'm coming from and presented the other view. Maybe I should listen. And it's been fun. There have been many times over the last 27 years here at Resurrection where people have said, that sermon changed my mind. It changed how I was thinking about this. And I came in ready, loaded for bear, because I knew I was going to disagree with where you were coming from. But you understood where I was coming from. You articulated it well. And then you offered me something thoughtfully with humility to think about, as opposed to you telling me how it is. And I often tell people, and some of your listeners have heard this before, but when it comes to prophetic preaching, you have to ask, what's my goal? Is my goal to irritate people or to influence them? Irritating them is really easy. It doesn't take any particular pastoral skill, no preaching skill to just get up and irritate people. If you actually want to influence them, that's a whole other matter. And the thing about the prophets in the Hebrew Bible is the prophets showed up and then they left. Like, they weren't the pastor of the church. They could come in and blast away, and they said what needed to be said, but they didn't have to be there the next week and shepherd people and care for them. They would preach to the public and not worry about it. When you're a pastor, you've got to ask, how can I be heard? B, have I actually heard the other side? Have I actually listened to the other side? And what role am I playing? What am I trying to accomplish here? And I found that humility and the ability to articulate the other side well, like you really understand the argument, opens the door for people to say, you help me think differently about this. And that, I find, that's when it works. It doesn't always work, though. I mean, I 27 years of working on this, I've written several books about this, and I still have times where I preach a sermon and clearly it was just, it wasn't balanced enough in the first 20 minutes to help people feel that way. And we have people leave the church every year and sometimes every month over some sermon I preached or some comment I made. And I have an email I want to share with your listeners here in a minute that I got just 2 weeks ago from somebody who's not coming to the church anymore because of this. So anyway, when we get a chance, I want to read that to them.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that I think that maybe some of our folks wrestle with is the sense of authority. I heard you say that part of your approach to this is saying, I could be wrong about this. How do you weigh the authority that has been given to you through the church as an ordained elder in our tradition, and the authority of the gospel truth with this sense of staying in relationship and staying engaged with someone that you might disagree with? I think that's maybe where sometimes people kind of get lost, but no, I've been authorized to say these things, and they say it with conviction and passion, not realizing they're shutting down kind of the other person.
Right. So there's an authorization that's an authority that's conveyed by your ordination, but the congregation has, that goes for about this much of what your relationship's going to be like with them. Largely authority. Now, if you're in the workplace and if all of your members were employees and they were paid and you could fire them and you could hire new employees, no problem. But if you're in a church where people are paying your salary and they're voluntarily choosing to be a part of your organization, then you either decide, I think I'm right about a lot of these things and I'm going to blast away, and then if we get down to 5 people left, that's fine, I'll turn it over to the next pastor who's going to come after me. But if you're dealing with a voluntary organization of people, then part of what you've got to do is figure out how do I win their willingness to listen to me. And so I'd say so one thing I'd say is on controversial issues, it's really hard to preach those sermons your first year of ministry in a local church. It probably ought to be your 3rd year by the time you've built enough leadership capital. I'm not saying you can't preach on any of those things, but you've got to build leadership capital. They have to trust you. They have to trust that you love them. Part of the ability my willingness to listen to you is you showed up at the hospital at 2 a.m. when my daughter was sick. And because of that, I'm not only willing to listen to you, but I'm willing to cut you some slack when I disagree with you and still come back the next week. But you come in there when you don't have that relationship, and your pastoral, the fact that you're the pastor and you went to seminary is only good for so much. And so I think a lot of this is about relationships, and the longer I've been at Resurrection, the more challenging topics I can talk about and get away with it. So 27 years in, but 27 years in, I still have people who leave or get mad and upset, when I preached on something that they disagree with. So, and that's another, here's a couple of the things. These are just random insights that I would just share. I've learned that if you stretch people, so people can be stretched so far and then they break. It's like a rubber band. You can pull them so far and then at some point it just snaps. So most people can be stretched them, and what you've got to figure out is have the intuition as a pastor to know how much can I stretch them before I've stretched them too far and they can't come back, or they're so upset and they can't really process. They just know, I don't want to go back there because it didn't feel good going to church that day. So there's a stretching, and then what I do is in a sermon series I might stretch people, and then the next sermon series is going to be reinforcing something so if I do a series on controversial issues, the next series might be on the Gospel of John, something that's not going to be quite as controversial. And what I find is that a large number of people need to know where are the lines. I'm willing to move the lines I just need to know that there's still lines. And they're not going to spend 20 hours thinking about the issue that you are preaching about that weekend with you. They're going to come, they've formulated their opinions based on wherever they got, their opinions from. And oftentimes, again, they're willing to be stretched. They just need to know, are there lines somewhere? I need to know if there are lines somewhere. So if you can stretch and then reaffirm or reassure them that there are boundaries, there are lines, and then when you do a controversial sermon or a series, then you might want to come back after that to be able to say, hey, now we're going to walk through one of the Gospels. We're just going to hear what Jesus had to say about whatever. And I find that rhythm has worked. I find I can get away with one sermon series a year that's on controversial issues. But throughout the year, there'll be 4 or 5 sermons that are going to be more around critical issues, because we believe the gospel has to do with what's happening in our daily lives. It's not just about in my personal spiritual life and my love for Jesus, but it's also about what's happening in the world around us.
Right. So maybe some practical advice for some of our pastors who are maybe learning a new congregation. Do you have any advice on how do you begin to determine how far they can stretch? Like, what are some of the skills, or what are some of the conversations or practices that you would suggest for a pastor who's getting to know their congregation in that first 5 years and figuring out how far can I push them? Like, how do they discover that?
Right. Well, first of all, part of the challenge is the average pastor is only 5 years long. And so, I found it at year 5, I could preach things I couldn't have preached before. And at year 10, I could preach things I couldn't have preached before. And most pastors don't have the luxury of getting to be there 5 or 10 years. I think a lot of this has to do with listening. It's sitting around the coffee shop or sitting around with people and saying, what do you think about this? I've been thinking about preaching on this. What do you think? But I also find surveys are really helpful. So we use SurveyMonkey a lot here. And in almost every sermon series we do that's controversial or challenging, we're going to use SurveyMonkey to get a pulse of where is the congregation on these issues. So I'll ask specific questions. I try to set up the survey where, they can quickly take the survey in 5 minutes or so, email the link out and say, I'm thinking about preaching on this. I'd really love to know, where are you at? What are your thoughts on this? And then have some open-ended places where they can give feedback. That gives you a chance. So like on guns, it was really helpful when I preached on, and that was a series of sermons I did a year ago, January, February. So it was going into the election season. Now here's another thing too. It's timing is a lot. So I knew I wanted to preach a series of sermons on the issues that divided our country. But I thought if I do that after the presidential primaries, it becomes Republican versus Democrat. Now all of a sudden you're becoming a partisan. If I'm doing it before, as the primaries are just getting started, there are candidates on both sides who are in different places on these issues. So doing it a year before the election was more helpful than doing it the year of the election. Or earlier in the season, I should say. So 16 was the election. We did it in January, February, as opposed to after the primaries and doing it in September or October. So when it came to guns, part of what I wanted to find out was actually before that, we did a survey of the congregation and said, what do you think are the most critical issues or the most divisive issues in the election season this year? We had 5,000 people take the survey. And, that allowed us to have a pretty good sense and we laid out 20 issues and they got to pick the 5. So when I came to preach the sermons, I said, you all picked these topics. I didn't pick them. You picked them. They were the top 5 issues. So suddenly, I let the congregation sort of set the agenda. And then I said, this isn't just going to be Pastor Adam's political views on these things. It's going to be, we're going to ask some questions about history. We're going to try to understand the issue from both sides. And then we're going to ask, does the Bible inform us in any way on how we might, tackle this issue? And I'll just mention for the rest of your viewers, Abingdon Press wrote a study guide for every one of these lessons. So we prepared the sermons hoping that churches would use these in their congregations, and it's all free. There's a study guide that's free online. If you're using it in a Sunday school class, they can watch the sermon. And the beautiful thing about watching the sermon and hearing me talk about these things is, as a pastor or a Sunday school teacher, you can say, well, I don't agree with him about that. And, or not everything about, that he said there. So let's talk about this. But it still gives you an opportunity to talk about these really critical issues. And when it came to the gun control one, it was, I was surprised that was the number one issue that came up at that time. And it may have been because there was a shooting not long before that. And every time there's a shooting, then there's one side is talking about we need more gun legislation, which paradoxically leads to greater gun sales every time somebody does that. So then we had during the Obama years, we had the highest sales of guns on record and ammunition and all this kind of stuff because people are afraid their guns are going to be taken away. And so we I wanted to hear where are these people coming from? What are the issues? One of the things I did on that particular sermon, it was the last in the series, is, I knew one of my members owned a shooting range, and he was big into guns. So I thought, well, I should go talk to him. So I went over there and I said, walk me through this. And I said, will you teach me how to fire a gun? And we went out and shot guns, and I had a film crew there filming me doing this. So the people who loved guns and shooting knew that I'd been to the shooting range where they shoot at, and and I listened to the guy who told me all the reasons why, he felt that we didn't need more gun legislation. I actually even watched Wayne LaPierre, the head of the NRA. I watched several videos that he put together. So I'm really trying to immerse myself in hearing where other people are coming from. And I think with your congregation, it doesn't take very long probably to spend time listening to folks and having a conversation with your church council or others. And for you to say, and I'm listening because I want to find out how can we talk about these things in a way that doesn't drive people away, but instead helps people to think, helps us together to think Christianly about our issues. And when you can say, I don't know that I have all the answers to it. In fact, I know I don't. I just want to try to understand and grow in this with you.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm just going to say for the sake of our viewers that if you would like to propose a question, please feel free to do that. You can do so within the question module on the GoTo webinar panel that should be on the side of your screen. So feel free to do that, and we'll try to get those questions answered. In the meantime, you've mentioned something about kind of immersing yourself in both sides. Are there issues in which there aren't two sides as far as you're concerned within the gospel message? And how do you deal with issues where it seems like Jesus is pretty clear about something?
Yeah. So of course there's and I wrote a book some years ago called Seeing Gray in a World of Black and White, and Bill Arnold at Asbury, I think he's at Asbury, wrote a book in response called Seeing Black and White in a World of Gray. And I've had people say, well, Hamilton thinks every issue is gray, and well, of course not. Every issue isn't gray. Racism is always wrong. Bigotry is always wrong. Abusing children is always wrong. I mean, there's a whole list of things that are always wrong. So those aren't hard issues to preach on. I mean, now there are places where preaching against racism will be really hard. But generally, people today are afraid to even speak up to say that they don't agree with you on those issues. But in those cases, if you're in a community, Luana and I have a place at the Lake of the Ozarks, and when I drive through Climax Springs and in certain back road areas, lots of Confederate flags around there. I listen to the local AM radio stations, and there's some stuff on there that's kind of interesting to listen to. And so if I'm in those congregations, I still have to ask the question. So I may have a gospel imperative about racism, but I still have to ask the question, how do I communicate that in a way that people can hear it? And also, what you want to listen to is, so Black Lives Matter, as an example. You have to understand what is the thought process behind the people who are saying, wait a minute, white lives matter too. And why am I saying that? Why am I feeling, what is the person, even if you don't like the thoughts that they have, what are the thoughts that they're having that you have to take into account? Otherwise, what you say just pushes them away as opposed to, again, being heard. The whole question is, how can I be heard? And a deeper question than that is, am I rightly understanding the issue, and am I rightly understanding God's perspective on the issue? Right. So I go back to the Civil War and slavery, and there were a whole host of preachers who were preaching sermons showing how the Bible supported slavery. So again, part of our task is making sure we're rightly understanding the heart of God and the character of God is seen through Jesus Christ. And then part of it is asking, how do we communicate that? How do we relate that to today's world? And then how do we communicate it? And so yes, there are black and white issues that we need to address, but a lot of them are not quite as black and white. And that's what happens when you start doing a little research and you start trying to understand where is somebody else coming from. As you start finding that maybe there's some, on really controversial issues where there's a large number of people who disagree, there probably are some good points on the other side. And so if you can understand those and articulate them, that helps you be able to communicate, the opposite view as well.
So that's a good question, because as pastors, we spend a lot of time immersing ourselves in either the source material or the social commentary around particular issues. And one of our listeners has a question, and it's related to this. She says, A good friend of mine challenged me the other day that the news feed regarding police misconduct, police shooting is slanted. In regards to that topic, Black Lives Matter, what sources are you using, or what sources do you trust when you try to immerse yourself into the issues surrounding the racial unrest that we're experiencing, or even the white supremacy concerns that we're seeing pop up around the country? Like, what do you trust, and how do you evaluate the sources of information as you try to understand where people are coming from?
Yeah, well, this is a great question, and this gets into something President Trump is routinely saying. That's he talks about the fake news, right? And so now we're in a place where our president has questioned the news media to see, are they really doing an unslanted or fair job in what they're doing? And the reality is that probably not. I read the New York Times, and last year I finally got to the point where, like, gosh, this is just so anti-Trump all the time that I feel like it's lost some of its objectivity. And what I said, I was at the Aspen Ideas Festival this summer, and I was speaking to a group of largely non-religious people, and David Brooks of the New York Times was interviewing me. We had a great conversation, and I said, one of the things that I feel with you guys in the media is if everything that Trump does is run up the flagpole as this horrible thing and look how bad it is, I can't differentiate when something really bad happens. Like, if everything's bad, then nothing is bad. I need you guys to be able to go, like, Barack Obama went out and smoked a cigarette on the front lawn. Nobody went out and wrote a whole story about it saying Barack Obama smoking cigarettes on the lawn of the White House. I mean, probably somebody did, but generally the broad media did not. If every time Trump tweets something, like, we wake up anymore in the morning wondering, what did President Trump tweet this morning? It makes it harder to tell when there's something serious that I need to pay attention to. And so there is, I think, undoubtedly a mainstream media bias right now, because he just has so denigrated the mainstream media and humiliated, or tried to humiliate them, and he's such a bully that it's really hard for people to I think, even for the media not to jump onto that, to be truly unbiased. But here's what I try to do. So in my news sources, I have a news feed on my iPad and iPhone, and it includes Breitbart, and it includes NPR, and it includes Fox News, and it includes CNBC, and I've got 4 or 5 different sources that are giving me a perspective on the world from different places. And my bias, I'm on theologically, I think I'm evangelical and more conservative, but when it comes to social issues, I'm probably more, I lean left, and I need to be able to hear voices on both sides to know, what are they thinking? How are they, I hear something will happen, and I think, how could anybody think other than this? How could anybody not think that's just the most dumb, stupid thing anybody could do? And then when I take the time to listen, I go, oh, that's what they were thinking. I might still think it's really stupid, but at least I understand. And when I've made mistakes over the years in preaching into difficult issues, because I do it, I think, fairly more probably than most large church pastors would do it. It's when I didn't take enough time to understand where the other person was coming from, where that 60% or 30% or 20% of my congregation might be coming from, or maybe it's only 10 or 15%. But how many of us can afford to lose 10 or 15% of our congregation in one sermon? We don't want to be doing that routinely. We've got to figure out, how do I communicate in a way? And for me, my most conservative members, many of them are like, I put up with him when he talks about that stuff, but I love all these other things about him, and I know he loves me, and so I will tolerate that. And every once in a while they go, wow, you made me think. And so I think that's the pastor's issue. But for us, I think we have to understand, where are people coming from on these, on both sides of an issue. And again, it's not that there's 2 sides are right. When it came to Charlottesville and the white supremacist movement and the march there, there was not 2 sides to people showing up with torches and in a pseudo neo-Nazi kind of rally thing. Now, there might be 2 sides to, what do you do with the monuments, the memorials, the Civil War memorials, and all that. Maybe there's 2 ways to talk about that. There's not 2 ways to talk about whether you come in and act like Nazis and say some of the things that some of these folks, Jews will not replace us, and all this kind of stuff. I mean, and just as a side note, I just came from Germany, where I preached a sermon on Martin Luther's life, and I retraced it in the various places where he lived. And one of the things that we did, we were going to Erfurt, and on the way we stopped at Buchenwald concentration camp. And it doesn't take much to go back and study what was going on then. To think about Martin Niemöller's comments about, first they came for the Jews, and they, I didn't say anything, so I wasn't a Jew, and then they came for the, it goes through that whole litany. But in Erfurt, part of what I found actually while I was over there in Germany was some of the horrible things Martin Luther written about the Jews. I mean, they wouldn't convert, and so one of the last things he talked about was they should just be killed. And Hitler starts taking this and using this, quoting Martin Luther in his PR machine, during the Holocaust. And so part of what you realize is that there are places where you have to stand up and it's really hard. And I thought to myself when Trump was elected, and I was not a Trump supporter. And there are places I actually agree with Donald Trump. There are things that he said, and I think that's right, although I'd never want to say that out loud. But I think, but somebody, somewhere along the way, reasonable people have to say, I think he might be right about this thing. But I also thought to myself, this, in its worst scenario, could turn really, really bad. And what price am I willing to pay if it gets that bad? And, I kind of resolved myself, if I had to resign my pulpit and leave, I would do that, if it meant standing up for groups or things that were happening. But you've got to figure out, when has that line been crossed? And I think I'm a long ways from that line. And I'm at the place where there are moments I want to lift things up. So after the president's executive order on immigration and stopping the refugee program, so that weekend I preached into this, and I said, and again, I tried to say some positive things about the president, and then I tried to say, but here's the history of what we do when we're afraid as Americans. And over the course of our history, when we were afraid and we were scared of the immigrants, we always did the things that we're embarrassed by later on. We always did things that don't reflect the love of God. And so, teach some history and some, and all of that, and then wound in the scriptures to that. So there are times where you just got to be firm and, gentle and firm and address the issue head on. But there's other times you've got to say, I know some of you are thinking this. Let me share with you why I think this might be the path. And I'll say one more thing, and then I'll shut up and take some more questions. But when Black Lives Matter, one of the things that I did with the congregation, because we're a 95% Anglo or 92% Anglo congregation, I invited some of our African-American members who sing in the choir and other places to share with me their stories, their experiences. And so I had those to share. So these are not my experiences, and they're not experiences from people who live halfway across the country or halfway, across the state. These are people who are your friends sitting around you. This is what they've shared. Then I interviewed two of our African-American pastors, or maybe three of our African-American pastors, and I asked them to share their stories. And I put that in the video, and I said, okay, so this is the experience of these pastors that you love. And then to be able to talk about it. And the reason why we have to say Black Lives Matter is because right now it doesn't feel like Black Lives Matter. The reason why we don't have to say White Lives Matter is nobody questions whether White Lives Matter. But the reason why we have to say Black Lives Matter is because right now there's a serious question for many Black people, and maybe for others, as to whether Black lives really matter. So there's a way to say that, but even that, people leave the church over that. So.
Right. Well, so let me take a question from one of our pastors on the line. They say we use the word prophetic a lot as we think about preaching. I appreciate your observation on the difference between the prophet and the pastor, but sometimes I'm tempted to avoid all controversy in order to just keep the peace. Yes. Any advice?
Yeah. So I've felt that, and I felt it in particular several years ago when I think it was maybe related to healthcare, or it might have been related to the war in Iraq. I don't remember. But I preached a sermon. I had a number of people who really were upset, and some of them left. And I remember after that, I think it was related to healthcare, Obamacare. And after that, I felt so stung and so hurt by that. Now, this has happened 20 times over the last 27 years, but in that particular sermon, I felt it more pronounced. I felt so hurt and so weary of getting the emails and the anonymous letters and the people who were leaving that I thought to myself, you're in danger of never preaching another sermon like that again because you're afraid. And I remember the next thing that came up, and I thought, God, I don't want to talk about this. Really, I just want to go preach a sermon about love your neighbors or love yourself or something without actually tying it into whatever the issue was. And I felt like the Holy Spirit said, and maybe it's just my own inner voice said, this is where you decide who you really are. You know, this is you can play it safe from here on out and never say anything hard again, or you're going to have to muster up the courage to do it this weekend. And so I find I have to, and I've told our people after one sermon that was a little difficult, I said, I need you to know something. I want to be liked. Most pastors are people persons. We want to be liked. We want our congregations to like us. We don't like getting nasty emails. We don't want people leaving the church. I mean, those are all things I don't want to have happen. And because of that, when I talk about something that's hard or difficult, I need you to know I have screwed up the courage that week one more time to try to say something that I think God wants said, and I could be wrong about it, but I'm trying because I care about you and I care about, the influence our congregation could have. And so if I'm wrong, I'm going to ask you to cut me some slack and just be gracious. And it's okay for you to disagree with me, but I need you to know the motive in this is not because I think I know all the answers, and I think I just want to tell you my personal opinions. I really think this may be something that has to do with our faith and how and what God wants us to know today. I could be wrong, but that's what I think. And usually 90% of the people clap, and 10% of the people don't clap, and those are the people I get more letters from.
Speaking of letters, you mentioned you had one. Did you want to share that?
Yeah, I do. I thought this might be kind of helpful. So I won't read the whole thing, but this person started out very kind. A lot of times letters I get are not kind, but this started out, Church of the Resurrection has been a blessing to me over the years. I've discovered a deeper and more heartfelt faith. We've been members for 20 years. I have so much respect for you as our pastor. You're compassionate, kind, and wise. I mean, all these really nice things. In your sermon today, you asked, is there anything I can do as your pastor to help you invite your friends and neighbors? And she said, over the last 5 years, I've gone from being a regular attender almost weekly to attending maybe 5 times a year. I listen to your sermon podcast, but I just don't attend. Prior to this, I talked about our church all the time. Now I don't talk about it hardly at all. Over the last years, my attendance dropped, and my inclination to invite someone to attend or an event or the worship services has stopped for one reason: politics. I believe that every single American has the right to believe in and support their political denomination. Our daughter, I don't share all this, it's personal, but I support your right to your beliefs. I attend worship to hear about God, not politics. So I stopped coming. I stopped inviting. I fear that I will invite someone on a day when you make a political statement and my friend will be offended or my customer will be offended. So there's something in the Constitution about church and state, which of course is usually a gross misunderstanding of what the separation of church and state is about. Admittedly, anyway. So there's some things I don't love about our church, but I'm desperate to attend. I'm broken and empty. My prayer every morning as I get in the parking lot is, Lord, please help me not to miss somebody that needs me today. I need to be filled up, but I feel like I'm struggling with loss in my church because you talk about politics. So I'm guessing every pastor has gotten a letter like that, probably many of them. And I thought I might share the response I wrote, which may not be the right response. I rewrote it like 10 times. I'm trying to figure out how do I respond to this. And I thought her, thanked her for a thoughtful letter. Said you're very gracious in how you expressed your feelings. I hate that you've not been attending and want you to be in worship and to find their spiritual nourishment. By the way, most often it's better to go meet with somebody in person than to do this by letter, but I was in Europe for the month and I got it right as I was leaving. So it's one of those pick-me-up letters you get as you're walking out the door. But she said, I wrote to her, I said, it might, and then she said somewhere in her letter, it wasn't so much what you said in your sermons, but it's sometimes the afterthoughts that really get me. So I said, it might be helpful for me to hear more of what you mean by the afterthoughts. If you could just write me and tell me what you're thinking about, because I don't know what you mean by that, but I certainly would like to hear your thoughts on it. I want to share my perspective so that you know where I'm coming from and what I feel and think regarding the question of politics and faith. I offer this more so that you know what's in my heart and my mind when discussing these things. I'm not trying to convince you of my position, only the reason I think it's impossible to carefully separate faith and politics. I begin with the question of what is politics. There are different definitions. One of the classics is Harold Laswell's, who defines politics as who gets what, when, and how. Another definition might be an act or the act of governance, including policy and lawmaking and enforcing for the common good. However it's defined, politics is not amoral. There are moral, ethical value judgments that must shape how we answer the questions of who gets what, when, and why. Likewise, there are moral and ethical value judgments behind the policy making and how we define the common good. So when it comes to morals, ethics, or values, these come from somewhere. We need and hope our politicians will make good moral and ethical decisions, but they represent the people who elect them. So ultimately, the question of morals, ethics, and values comes down to we the people. So where are our values, morals, and ethics shaped? And some in the homes, some in our schools, but the church has always been seen as a primary place where this happens, where morals and ethics are shaped. And interestingly enough, when I was in Germany, only 12% of the population go to church, but in the public schools, they have a class on religion, which is meant to teach the religious foundations for moral and ethical behavior. And if you're an atheist, they teach a class with the same material, they just don't tell you about the church in it. But even in Germany, it's considered, the church is considered a fundamental part of teaching this. So I kind of shared that with her. And then I said, morality and ethics for Christians are shaped by our understanding of who God is and God's will for our lives. Hence, the line between politics and religion is not always easy to define. My role as a pastor is to evangelize, to disciple, to shepherd, and to care for our flock. It's also to teach and to foster Christian ethics and values, to help our people look at the issues we face as a nation through the lens of our faith. The Bible is replete with examples of religious leaders addressing morals and ethics that affect society. Much of what Moses taught related to ethics, the prophets, nearly a third of the Old Testament, addressed questions that many would consider political. And their overarching concern was justice, the Hebrew word mishpat, a word that appears over 200 times in the Old Testament. Jesus and his apostles also spoke about issues of justice and concern for the poor and the vulnerable. I quoted Tim Keller, who said, mishpat describes taking up the care and cause of widows, orphans, immigrants, and the poor. Those have been called the quartet of the vulnerable. Consistently in Scripture, there is a concern for the vulnerable. The New Testament continues the Old Testament tradition, etc. So because I'm not sure which things I've said, either in sermons or outside of sermons that you're referring to, it's hard for me to know what left you feeling uncomfortable in worship. Most of my sermons, I think, are aimed at teaching, discipling, shepherding, and evangelizing, but there are elements that will address how our faith speaks to what's happening in our world today, the ethics and morals and values. And I plan a series of sermons each year to address these topics. As a pastor, I've tried to raise these concerns and speak about issues in a way that helps people hear both sides of a topic and then to gently, and I hope with humility, offer my assessment of the issue. I don't fear when I meet Christ face to face that he'll tell me I spoke too much about these things. I fear that he'll tell me he's disappointed that I didn't speak up when I should have. None of this may be what you're talking about when you mention politics that have kept you from church, which is why I want to know more about what you're feeling. And then I mentioned, I tell the groups who join our church at Coffee with the Pastors that I try my best to understand how Scripture and faith relates to the issues that we're facing in our world, and that's, I think, what Methodists do. And to be the best messenger I can, but I will get it wrong sometimes, and then I give them permission to disagree. And then finally, I mentioned we have both Republicans and Democrats. Somehow they've managed to find a way to stay engaged. And I share with her that I feel like I'm independent. She mentioned that she and I were as opposite of one another in politics as could be, and I'm like, well, I don't know. I'm independent, so I'm not sure how that works. But and then I finally just said, I care about you. I want you to be in worship. I wonder if there's a way you might attend regularly. Know that from time to time I'll say something with which you disagree, and that's just okay. And I think about our congressman from this area, and he and I disagree on a lot of things, but he's here almost every Sunday, and we talk about issues, and we disagree, but we love each other, and I support him as a congressman, and he supports me as a pastor, and somehow that's been okay for him. Is it possible it could be for you too? If I've misunderstood your concerns, forgive me. I know that I love you and your family. I look forward to hearing back from you. Thanks again for your kind words and willingness to share your views with me. So that's, I read that, just it's a long letter, but just to say that's kind of the tenor of the conversations. I'm not going to give up ground on that we can and should speak about moral and value judgments and ethics, but at the same time, to listen, to try to hear where she's coming from, and to help her understand, here's where I'm coming from when I speak about these things.
And you've mentioned this already, and kind of alluded to it. What I hear from, like, where I sit in the role of the conference is so many of our pastors we take it so personally when people write us these letters, when people just disappear, and you just kind of never hear from them again, right? Like they just disappear. And yep. It feels so personal. From your years of experience, like, how do you reconcile that within yourself? What advice do you have for the pastors on the line who have had people leave specifically because of their interpretation of the gospel, or a message they've given, or one of those other after remarks that you don't even know what it is you said? How do you deal with it?
Yep, it's really hard, and it's gotten easier over time. But it's never completely easy when you get one of those letters. When I get a letter, either an anonymous letter, and I tell people I don't read them, but I still read them, and or I don't get very many of those anymore. But you get those, and it just crushes you just feel like somebody just poked you in the chest with a dagger. It's painful, or punched you in the gut, and it's really important to have people to talk to about those things when that happens. I think whether it's a group of colleagues, in ministry, where you can share, hey, this just happened, and they can say, hey, hang in there, my spouse has been that for me many times. Over the years, and part of it's a maturity in age, and part of it's just life experience, I've come to be more okay with the fact that that's going to happen sometimes, and I don't want it to happen. And interestingly enough, more often than not, if I can meet with the person and talk to them. So this happened earlier this year in the sermon on immigration, and I had one of our parishioners who'd been here for a long time, a really great guy. He and his wife, second row people, terrific folks, and he stopped coming to church. And fortunately, now in smaller churches you can figure this out. Here we figure it out because we take attendance, and we have people who call after 3 weeks of not being in worship. And this guy said, it's just something Adam said in that sermon really bothered me. I just haven't been back since. And so I called him up and I said, hey, can we sit down together? And we sat down together, and I said, tell me what I said and how you heard it. And he heard me saying that we needed to take all 6 million Syrian refugees into our country, and that there was no room for greater vetting processes or whatever else. And I'm like, and he said, I'm afraid for my grandkids. I'm afraid for their safety, for their future. And fear plays a huge role in how we react to these things. And I said, gosh, that wasn't what I was saying at all. Of course, I don't think we can take 6 million people in, and I wouldn't advocate for that. I said but I also think we have to recognize the Syrian refugee crisis is the greatest crisis in the world today among refugees, and for us to indefinitely eliminate the possibility of people who are in trouble coming over here, I don't think that's right either. And he said, well, no, I agree with that. So we kind of went back and forth. And I said, I think we pretty much agree with each other, don't we, on this? And he said, well, I guess we kind of do. And so by the time we were finished, we prayed together. He hugged me. He said, thank you so much. It's meant so much that we had a chance to have this conversation. Now, picking up the phone to call the person to do that, all of us hesitate to do that. In fact, many times we'll let people leave rather than pick up the phone and call them, because it's painful to think about that. But the thing was, when he left, I felt so much better. It's like, oh, this is great. I didn't lose a member. He knows where I'm coming from. I understand better where he was coming from, and it worked out really good. And he's going to tell all of his friends about that too. And so, taking the time to pick up the phone, to sit down with somebody in person instead of I responded by email on this one, but if I'm in town, picking up the phone and meeting with somebody if I can. The problem at Resurrection is we might have 10 or 12,000 people on a weekend. I won't know. They will just leave, and I'll never know. And I might not even know who they were before they joined. I know about 3,000 people by name, and the rest of them somebody knows, but I don't necessarily know them by name. It makes it harder to do that. But if you're in a smaller or medium-sized church, to be able to sit down with somebody over a cup of coffee and say, hey, let me just share with me. And, okay, well, I didn't understand that. This is where I was coming from. And almost always, they're going to walk away going, thank you, and I respect you more because you met with me, and I see where you were coming from now. And you will have grown, too, in the process of doing that. I've done this hundreds of times, and I used to say I learned how to eat crow, and I even think it tastes good now. It's okay to say I'm sorry. I missed it. And sometimes you didn't miss it, but to be able to say, I clearly didn't communicate in a way that was as helpful as it could have been. Or, we might agree to disagree on this, but I love you anyway. And there's something about when your pastor's sitting down face-to-face with you and saying that, pretty hard to say, well, I'm leaving anyway. That doesn't always work out that way, but a large part of the time it does.
It reminds me of this instrument that is the sermon, is this really fragile thing that we're entrusted with. And sometimes we give it life, and it's a wonderful thing, and sometimes it's not. We don't do it well, and maybe we strike out. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the other opportunities that pastors and spiritual leaders have to engage congregations and maybe to push them in different areas on controversial topics outside of the sermon itself, and how does Church of the Resurrection do that?
Yeah, Kim, that was a really great question, and actually, that's what I would say for most pastors who are 5 years, who haven't spent at least 5 years with their congregation, is that most of the time when you deal with these issues, it might be best to deal with it in a forum, in a class, and something else. That's part of why my very first book I wrote 17 years ago was called Confronting the Controversies. And I talked to Abingdon at the time, and I said, could we put together, maybe edit down the sermons, give leaders guides, and let pastors do this with their congregation on a Wednesday night Bible study or dinner and conversation or something, where I can say the hard things, and then they can have the conversation with their people, let people talk, and then they can kind of weigh in without taking the hits themselves, because I know what it feels like to take the hits. And I try to do that with that and probably about 5 different studies along the way. But I think often it's best handled in a sermon, and most pastors don't even have 30 minutes. I get about 35 minutes, but a lot of pastors, you got 20 minutes. How are you going to cover something in 20 minutes? It's complicated and complex. And often you can't do an adequate job of addressing the topic. But if you can do that on a Wednesday night where you've got an hour and a half and you have time for discussion around tables and question and answer, and that is often the very best format. And also bringing in other experts. So one of the things we've done, like just recently with Charlottesville, we hosted a forum here at the church. We actually had the assistant rabbi from Charlottesville, whose synagogue was at one point, folks were out there in front of the synagogue with torches, and we Skyped her in. And we had about 1,200 people who showed up for this event on a Sunday night, talking about what's happening in our world. We had somebody from the Kansas City Star come in and talk about the rise of white supremacist groups, and in the end, I think it was much more helpful that if I tried to cover it was an hour and a half deal, than I tried to cover it in 32 minutes. And we've done that with the Palestinian-Israeli question. So I brought in people from both Jews and Palestinians, and we've had forums where we invited people to hear about this. We did this on the Affordable Care Act, and I brought in speakers who were across the spectrum, from the health insurance industry to the end providers, and it was a very helpful forum. And a lot of times we'll do those and publicize them so people can, and they're online, so people can take them down and show them in their congregations. But that is often more helpful than trying to cover it in a 30-minute sermon. There are times where you have to address things in sermons, but there may be a better format than that. Same-gender relationships, marriage. This is the issue in the United Methodist Church today, right? In terms of the things that are, most likely to divide us, and as a denomination probably will divide us in the not too distant future. So, on that issue, you've got to understand where are your people at, and then you've got to figure out how to communicate with them, and at the same time have a measure of humility. And so I address this on a regular basis. I'm going to do it again this weekend, but finding a way to do it that helps people hear you and understand is really important. It's, again, hard to cover that in a 30-minute sermon. I remember years ago, we have a large pastoral team, about 16 clergy elders on our staff. And some of the younger clergy were like, why don't you just really have the courage to preach this 30-minute sermon and, really lay it out? So I asked this question: how long did you always believe what you believe about same-sex marriage and, same-gender relationships? And always they say, well, no. So how did your views change on that? They say, well, I got a master's degree from a mainline theological seminary, and then I got to know people, and I had relationships and all. And I said, so it took you what sounds like about 5 or 6 years to change your views on this, and you think I can change everyone's views in a 30-minute sermon? Isn't it possible that people need the time and space to be able to process these things? And part of what you're doing is you're helping you're helping people think about things they hadn't thought of from a perspective they hadn't had before, as opposed to telling people this is how you have to think about this, and thinking that that's going to be enough to change their minds. So figuring out how do you persuade, how do you influence, what's the right medium, and then how do you, and when it comes to sermons, how do you actually accomplish that? And the sermon where we lost the most number of people was back in 2004, and I preached. It was right before General Conference, and we just moved into our new, what at the time was our new sanctuary. It's now our fellowship hall, and I preached a sermon on this, and we had 800 people leave the church in the next 12 months, and it was I have never been so depressed in my life. It was the most painful. I kept thinking, maybe I guess I'm not supposed to do this anymore. Maybe I need to find another job. I'm not. This is not. And I remember asking my wife this. Some of your folks have heard this, but we had horses at the time. We were mucking out the barn. It was about 25 degrees out, and I said, this is like 6 months in, and I said, I don't think I can do this for the rest of my life. Are you okay if we move and if I go do something else? I was so stinking depressed. And she said, I'll go wherever you feel like God is calling you, but I have this question for you. Is God calling you to leave, or are you running away? Mm. And I realized I was running away because it just hurt so much. And it took about 6 months, 6 more months. It was about a year process to work through that. And I still feel some of the pain of that from years ago. And then things kind of turned around. And I will say, most of the best experiences I've had at Resurrection have been since that time. And I'm glad I didn't quit and leave, at that moment. I would have missed out on all those things, but I felt like it. And I felt like I'd failed God. I felt like anyway.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I do think that is the area that I hear the most from our clergy, is just kind of struggling to deal with, that sense of righteousness and kind of naming where we believe God, what God has laid on our hearts, but then also trying to care for these people that we've been entrusted to care for and to serve, and how to do that. And it's hard work. We've got time for one more question, and I want to talk just about a little bit about your own spiritual practice. We've mentioned that it seems like almost every day, we wake up, we look for a tweet, we look for like what has gone on in the world. Constantly there is something. That the incident in Manhattan recently is yet another example of just, it feels like there's just one thing after another, and so much so that I do think that we can become kind of numb to all of these incidents. As spiritual people, we're called to not be numb to the world. So how do you care for yourself in the midst of fighting for justice, and how do you not become numb to kind of what we see in the world around us?
Yeah, that's a good question, Kim. So first, I want to thank you for inviting me to be on this program with you, and thanks to all of those folks who are listening and joining us. I think the numbness happens in a couple different ways. So I'm going to step back from it a bit. I remember after about the 4th or 5th time I buried a child at Resurrection, I started feeling numb about that. And it scared me, actually, because the first time I buried a child, I laid flat on my face on the floor in my living room and cried for hours, 2 hours that night, having held this child in my arms at the hospital, just after he died. And I thought, I've lost something, and then I realized it was God's way of protecting me from being overwhelmed by that, over and over again. But when it comes to the stuff that happens in our world, I think we do have to, I think you're normal that after a while you get like kind of numb to it. I think about, so there's the hurricane in Houston, then there's a hurricane in Florida, and then there's the impact of the hurricane in Puerto Rico. Well, we took up a big offering for Houston. We gave a little bit to Florida. Puerto Rico comes, and it's the worst of all of them, and our people are just, they're numb. It's like I can't think anymore about. So we had to wait a few weeks before we started doing something, related to that. I think it's normal. You get so used to these things, and it's part of your brain's way of coping with tragedies that happen. And so you have to you have to almost pinch yourself and go, okay, something bad just happened. You should somehow say something about it, or at least you should be praying about it. Our pastors, in the congregation, in the pastoral prayer, I just tell them every week, you've got to be watching what's happening in the news this week, because you're mentioning that in the pastoral prayer may be the only time those people stop to pray about the people in Puerto Rico who are out of power. And if you don't think about it, they're probably not thinking about it. And that's part of the power of the pastoral prayer, I think, is helping the people pray for things they should have been praying for, but maybe hadn't been praying about. I think in our spiritual life, which is a little different question, but they're intersected, my spiritual life, I find there are seasons where you feel empty and dry there too. Or, after 27 years or now 30 years of being a pastor, my spiritual life often feels rote, and it feels mundane, and sometimes broken, and you have to go back and, and so for me, it's partly reading, it's partly, I have a practice of trying to pray 4 or 5 times a day at least, but those are usually short little prayers. I mean, they're not even, it's pathetic, sometimes. I try journaling for seasons, especially during Lent, and I'm in a small group, and I read my Bible every morning. I just make myself, I'm going to read the scriptures every morning. But then it's praying, Lord, please help me to be the real deal. Help me not to fake it. Help me to be and sometimes you have to fake it, but help me to be what this help me be the person these people believe I am. Help me be the person you want me to be. And that is my prayer almost every single day. The Wesleyan Covenant prayer is some variation of it I pray every day. Often it's just shortened to, here I am, I'm yours, do with me whatever you want. But I think it's easy for us over the long journey to find that, just like marriage, you know, when I was dating LaVon, man, I couldn't wait to see her. My heart raced. Today, it's not the same. But it's deeper. Right. It's a deeper level.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that and offering your wisdom. I just want to thank you again, Reverend Hamilton, for your wisdom and your insight on this topic. And I want to encourage those of you who are watching that if you haven't already registered for next week, which is our final in this series with Reverend Dr. David Gushi, who is the Distinguished University Professor of Christian Ethics and the Director of the Center for Theology and Public Life at Mercer University, who will join us. We've also added kind of a fifth week where we'll have a Facebook Live kind of question and answer while we have two of our pastors, a retired elder and an active pastor here in Missouri, who are going to take what we've learned over the course of 4 weeks and kind of talk about their own personal experiences pastoring and ministering to congregations who are often very different than them, both theologically and politically, and yet still manage to figure out a way to share the gospel with them. So thank you again, Adam. I appreciate it. I appreciate your time.
Thanks,
and thank you to everyone who's joined us this evening.
Bless you.
Bye-bye.